Immortals of Avium is a fast-paced, cinematic, single-player first-person shooter that swaps out shooting shells for slinging spells. The debut game from independent developer Ascendant Studios, it's a brand new IP with AAA level production quality, no battle passes or any trace of modern gaming faff, and it's all powered by shiny new Unreal Engine 5 tech. And yet, I found it hard to love. Creating interesting new IP is no small thing, and Immortals of Avium puts a lot of effort into creating its world and backstory. Things kick off with a brief bit of expository text explaining that there's some kind of big wound and an ongoing Everwar between Magni fighting over control of magic in the world. But in the opening hours, it feels like it all boils down to two-dimensional good and bad guys, and you're just shockingly the chosen one who will save the world. But over the course of Avium's campaign, which took me roughly 11 hours to get through, the characters and lore do get fleshed out quite well, but it's a world that's so over the top and so far removed from our own that it's hard to relate to any of the characters. I personally always prefer my sci-fi and fantasy to feel a bit more grounded. I did also find the protagonist Jack and some of the dialogue to be occasionally grating, leaning into that style of gamery, quote-unquote comedic banter.
You weren't here for my speech to the selection candidates, Initiate. So I'll give you the short version.
So, it is happening?
Shut up.
There is some excellent performance capture and strong performances, and a few nice little moments that end up making for an interesting, if sometimes annoying, cast of characters.
Yeah, I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't understand. That's what you sound like.
Of course, story and world building is good and all, but gameplay is what really makes or breaks a game, and Avium's magic-based Doom-style combat is pretty satisfying. The core of your spell blasting comes from just 3 magic sigils. The blue sigil acts as an accurate and trusty rifle, red is your close-range shotgun, and green is your middle ground, fast-firing machine gun. These are the only weapons in the entire game, and I was worried it may make combat eventually feel kind of samey, but you will find weapon variations that alter their damage, rate of fire, and clip size. Just don't expect anything to stray too far from those 3 archetypes. What keeps combat interesting is that new elements are constantly introduced for you to juggle. These include things like powerful special attacks known as Furies, a mega magic laser dominion attack that charges as you fight, and equipment like grapple hooks, limpets to slow down enemies, and a disruptor beam thingy, all adding up to give you a lot to keep your fingers busy with during combat. There's also a solid roster of enemies to keep you on your toes, with a good mix of grunts, ranged attackers, in-your-face brutes, and various special units, as well as some color-coded units which are weak to specific types of magic, forcing you to constantly mix things up. Meanwhile, double jump, float, and dash abilities also contribute to keeping the action feeling fast and agile, and a manually activated shield gives you the opportunity to swap playstyles between more tanky or mobile and agile on the fly. Now, I didn't think I'd ever be saying this, but I think the graphics are maybe too much at times. Between all the spells, explosions, and stuff going on, it can overwhelm your eyeballs and be easy to get lost in the action. Some of the elaborate enemy and level design can also kind of blend together and make it hard to make out distant enemies. Often I was kind of just shooting towards wherever the magic was flying from. While I enjoyed the combat, most encounters within the campaign felt like they were over just as I was getting warmed up, and made me want more. I kept expecting another wave or two in most fights and often felt like, oh, is that it? Few battles really felt like much of a challenge, with plentiful health and mana stones available. If you're a seasoned shooter fan, you may want to dive into this on the hardest difficulty. There's also quite a lot of story and talking between all the combat, and while I enjoy when games give you some time between all the action, in this case I would have liked the balance to tip a little more into combat. Thankfully, scattered around the world are gates that lead you into Fanes, which are little optional challenge rooms, and some of these absolutely humbled me. But I just wish there was a little more challenge within the main campaign. Levels themselves are largely linear, but make up parts of much larger semi-open worlds, with plenty of side areas to dive into, where you'll often find little environmental puzzles, which will reward you with some extra materials or even gear, so it's easy and enjoyable to let yourself get distracted. There's a solid few hours you can add onto the game's runtime here if you want to do all the Fanes and find all the things. Although while I appreciated having a few bits of new gear to find, you don't really get a lot of it, which makes gear in general feel like a bit of an afterthought, and for most of the game, the gear you do find is about the same as what you already have, with maybe a few slightly different stats. There's just very little dopamine hit or excitement from any of the loot drops here. Likewise, while I appreciated having a little skill tree to work my way through, most of the skills felt like filler that just boosted a bit of damage or armor, although it does have some room for light build crafting with a few more interesting perks scattered through it. I enjoyed my time blasting through the magical world of Immortals of Avium. It's not going to go into many people's top shooters of all time lists, but it's a fun and often spectacular spell-slinging romp. Overall, it's an impressive debut effort for Ascendant Studios, who I commend for swinging for the fences, even if they didn't quite hit it out of the park. Play.